Thank you. The floor is now open. Please say who you are before you speak, and remember you're recording this event. And by the way, a summary of today's event, along with the set presentation, is going to be online by Monday morning.
Okay.
Thank you for that interesting presentation. My name is Farah Ahmed, and I'm a master's student at the Institute for Education. I have two questions and maybe a comment. The first was that you mentioned that many states in Africa don't have social capital, whereas some scholars have argued that there is a type of social capital but which is not beneficial to all of society. There is a negative type of social capital. Could you comment on that? And the second question is, throughout your presentation and also David's comments, I didn't hear the word civil society, whereas that might describe a lot of the processes that you've been talking about. Is there a reason for that? And related to that, it's also been linked closely to the democratization project, whereas that hasn't come up in your discussion. Could you comment on that, please, as well? Thank you.
Tony on the left and then James at the back.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, we're taking a few questions.
Thank you. Phil Sigley, Federation of Cocoa Commerce. We didn't hear too much about mainstream business until the last slide. Now, what we're finding, we are designing systems for the mainstream markets, and for Sierra Leone, Liberia, we can certainly come up with, and I have done that, designed a vehicle. You submit that vehicle to DFID or to AFD or to the European Union, and there is no interest because mainstream markets are an area that many development agencies don't want to go into. They're preoccupied with niche markets. Now, if you look at, I presented fatal transactions meetings, the Belgo-British conference on natural resources and conflict, for example. Now, take Sierra Leone. We could plant cocoa, but people will not go into that market in the current situation and in the scale that is required because of the risk. Now, you exposed some areas which, I can come on to later if I had time, but basically what we need is, for example, pooled resource, not competing development agencies, and you mentioned about this proliferation of NGOs. We need to stop all this NGO activity until you put in place, first of all, something to work with. There are infrastructure issues and roads and so on. Now, basically, the country risk, when I presented in Brussels recently, I suggested that maybe a World Bank could look at taking the country risk so that businesses would move in and bring the skills, knowing that the risk of, if something went wrong, if the, let's say the peace failed to be held and the conflict broke out again, that their assets were at least somewhat protected. Now, this will produce growth, and I'd like to continue a lot of information about local community building, but I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. James.
Thank you, James Darcy, the head of the Humanitarian Policy Group here at ODI. Seth, I thought your book was terrific. Thank you for writing it. It was excellent. You set the problematic, if you like, in the title, Fixing Fragile States. And on your own analysis, the fixing of fragile states is something that may take many generations, possibly centuries, and indeed is something that we in the international community can only really facilitate. We can't engineer it. But meanwhile, the problematic we tend to deal with more day to day in the development realm is the symptoms of fragility, if you like. The thing that keeps people poor, the thing that means they can't feed their families, that means maternal mortality is astronomical. The things that are articulated, if you like, in the MDGs and that agenda. And elsewhere, there are people who are, unsurprisingly, concerned about state security, international security, these kinds of problems. I suspect the way in which we're engaging with fragile states is more to do with that kind of problematic than it is to do with the fixing of the fundamentals. How do we reconcile those two things? You don't say much about that in the book, but for some of us that's a pretty urgent question.
Okay, perhaps we can take this round of questions first. I'm going to add one. I was interested in your comments about decentralization or decentralized processes, and I'm just curious about why do you think that in different contexts that you mentioned, this decentralizing power and, for example, holding elections locally and focusing on urban issues is going to necessarily address some of the problems around cohesion, and particularly even if they do have to reconcile them with the need for some national level reconciliations or agreements or stability, in fact.
Okay. Could I have your name? I didn't quite get your name. Farah. F-A-R-A-H. F-A-R-A-H. Farah. All right. Let me just go from David's downward. First, I just want to make 2 points on what you said. First, thank you for the summary. Thank you for the analysis, the recommendation. I just want to make the point, when I refer to social cohesion, I'm not always referring to ethnicity or religious identity groups. The key point is a society must be socially cohesive. In many cases, you don't have the chance to simply leverage a cohesive, the Kurds in the north of Iraq, the Isaac clan in Somaliland, or in other cases you might be to promote greater cohesion on a national level, as Ghana and Tanzania have done to a certain extent. But the key point is cohesion can be cross-ethnic groups, can be cross-religious groups, but when you don't have it, you don't have progress. The ideal scenario is where you can leverage the pre-colonial social networks which still exist in most places. In some cases, you don't have that chance, but to the extent you try to build a state like the Congo, you're never going to have social cohesion. But if you build around cities, you might be able to promote much more cohesion. And then let me go through Farah. First, these societies actually have a lot of social capital, but they don't have society-wide social capital. The network, people you trust, your family, your people from your town, people from your church. Religion is, we didn't talk about it, but religion actually is a very, very underappreciated part of building social capital and building strong societies, especially in the Middle East, but even in large parts of the other developing countries. So the fact that these countries do have social capital, but we're not taking advantage of them, to the extent that social capital can be negative, of course. Religion, in certain cases, has made very cohesive groups which have negative objectives. Having said that, the question, therefore, is how do you take such cohesive groups and funnel them or focus them more on promoting society-wide positive change? It's a much larger argument, but I don't disagree with your point. But I would argue actually that Islam in particular has great capacity to build cohesion, great capacity to build social capital, and it is not appreciated that way. That's a much longer debate. Of course, civil society matters, but again, democracy, of course, matters. And this will go to your point about decentralization in elections. To the extent that the state is structured in ways that promote cohesion, that promote forms of accountability that can work. A national election in the Congo does not promote much accountability. The population's got no way to hold a distant president and a distant capital accountable unless you live in Kinshasa and people there, if they're unhappy, they can actually hold the person down the street very accountable. In societies with weak state structures, you're going to be most successful in holding leaders accountable, making them work better when they're right next to you. This means small-scale accountability. No, it's not easy because, of course, it can very easily be corrupted. It can very easily be hijacked. It can very easily be a few people can take charge out of the light of the international community, even worse than on national level. But to the extent we want to build systems that are self-sustaining and able to manage their own affairs, we're much more likely to make this work on small scale, where there's people that can come together, where the leaders have the face-to-face accountability in many ways works. Imagine there's no state, there's no formal, and your leader's distant, I mean, whether it's one ethnic group, one clan group, or groups of people living together from different backgrounds, this is much more likely to going to work. And that's why I focus on decentralization and us helping. The international community could play a greater role helping local elections to some extent like we do national elections, but there's really not much focus on that right now. Mainly we just help an election and we leave. Still, it should be obvious, and my background should suggest that I'm a very, very big proponent of investment and private business. Having said that, and there's a lot of talk right now about the fragmented nature of international assistance. My main argument is that the real problem is not the international community is divided, it's the societies are divided. And, many countries have made progress over the last few decades. International community was divided for them as well. The fact that the international community is divided and the society is divided, that makes the problem much worse. Since the society is cohesive and reasonably well governed, the fragmented nature of the NGOs and everything should not be a problem, actually. NGOs can do a lot of wonderful help. The issue is how do you make the state work such that NGOs and the civil society are doing things that are promoting a strong state. In terms of your idea of risk, of course, the major issue I raise is when there's no social cohesion and there's very limited social capital on a communal level, the political risk is high. I would argue the risk of property rights and the risk of transactions is very high. Therefore, I'm not going to invest in a factory in Nigeria because I can't trust it's going to be there tomorrow, and I can't trust that I can never make trades within the country that are going to be protected by the government. And this is what you talk about, but I would argue the problem is really with the fragmented nature of society. But of course, more investment is always good. The problems are never going to be solved in Brussels, though. And lastly, James, thank you for your comments, and I very much agree that the international community is focused on symptoms. It's focused on quantitative. It's great to have goals like MDGs. It's great to try to argue for more aid, but numbers don't help countries. To the extent that a country is reasonably well governed, a middle-income country in most cases, MDGs can help them focus on more appropriate targets. To the extent that government doesn't work very well, this is a great distraction in many cases. The fact that we argue about aid, we don't argue about how to make states work better. A fundamental argument in my book is that there is no strategy to help fix fragile states. We want to help. We're doing lots of little things that make sense. Elections, constitution writing, peacekeeping troops, more aid, more schools, more hospitals. It's all great. But what's the strategy to make these countries work? There is no strategy, partly because the international community is fragmented, partly because these states don't have any cohesion or any capacity to look at strategy. Therefore, we fall back on the same method over and over again, and there's no centralized. The closest thing to a centralized body is the World Bank, and economists are not going to solve the problem that's political, anthropological, sociological in nature. And to the extent that they follow only economics, doesn't make it work. So how do we change this? It's a very big point of discussion. I would argue that very, very hard to change, and this is a frustration for anyone who's in this field who has the same worldview that I do. The main thing I think we can do is that we need to build much greater capacity, possibly in partnership with organizations like ODI, capacity within countries, in partnership with people who want to help outside to analyze the problems that I mentioned and to build plans, build strategies, eventually build capacities to redirect effort in a way that would be more sustainable. Until someone has a better model to how to build the Congo, and until someone makes a detailed blueprint and then start pressuring all the parties involved, domestically, internationally, it's very hard to see why anyone has an interest to change, because everyone's doing what's natural, doing what they think is right, and what's also in their self-interest, given their international or their organizational culture or their country, political, institutional culture. So until we begin to change the storyline, change the strategy, change the storyline about development, we're like that car riding forward, and I'm half awake, half asleep, and it's on autopilot. And until someone changes the autopilot to manual pilot, and until someone's actually going to begin to turn off that computer, turn off the autopilot, take out my map, start to plot a real strategy to where I'm trying to go. Until someone begins to think that way, we're not going to get to where we're going. We're just going to keep going down this long highway to no place. Excuse the analogy.
No. Okay. Can I have another round of questions? There are a couple, but I got one actually for somebody who's watching online, and that is somewhat related to what I just asked you. An excellent presentation, thank you. I have one question that interests me, and apologies if it's been covered before. If you build bottom-up, empowering regions and possibly ethnic groups, how, in real terms, do you unite people as a whole in the country? Is there a danger that one region will be stronger than another depending on its resources and development success, and this could expose cracks which may result in balkanization? Additionally, how does one cope with spoilers in this context? And that comes from Richard Clark, who is currently in Eindhoven. There's one question here on the right, and then I'll come to everybody else.
Thanks very much. James Dean, I'm Head of Policy at the BBC World Service Trust, and we're a media development organisation. So I'm going to ask about the media, I guess, but in the context of your wider comment. So as I understand it, the argument is that effectively fragile states are fractured states, and we need to build social cohesion at the most pragmatic level that will actually work with its local governments, local, national, if possible. We work on the media. We're doing a policy briefing on the media in fragile states later this year, in fact, and we're really struggling with this issue. A lot of what we see is that cultural identity is increasingly enhanced at the expense of national identity. That's largely been driven significantly been driven by media liberalization and the growth, for example, of local language radio stations, which are enhancing cultural identity, arguably enhancing cultural cohesion at the local level, but at the expense of a serious national public debate, a serious national polity, the capacity for conversations, if you like, across fracture points in society. So I guess just to bring this sort of very practically, you mentioned Tanzania. Tanzania is a country which has obviously invested over 40 years in a national identity and a sense of social cohesion, but it's at the expense of local language, in fact, and Nyeri's decision to invest in Swahili. And compare that to Kenya, where the same thing was not happened, and you have a much more divided set of identities with this language. But you seem to be suggesting that an investment in local language capacity or operating at the local language level is something to be desired. So I'm a bit confused about where this sits in terms of the different fracture points and what the actual strategy is, and particularly when it comes to media, which is such a defining issue in terms of cultural identities. It's an issue, as I say, we're struggling with, and it would be good to get some comments on that.
What was your name?
James Dean.
James. Thank you, James.
You can't forget James Dean.
No, I can't. I'll be of a better faith than he did.
Liam, one over there. Now, please ask you to keep your comments and questions as far as possible brief, so others have the chance to intervene. Thanks.
Hello, my name is Edward Bell. I work for International Alert. We work in about 20 different conflict-affected and fragile countries, and I work particularly on Nepal. And my comment is very much driven from my experience there. And Seth, I completely agree with this emphasis on social cohesion, and I like also the notion of inappropriate institutions. I just have two questions, both maybe for David and you. So first of all, in this political settlement that these states need to go through, I think, what are your thoughts on quota systems, reservations in the political system and particularly in the civil service? I think often progress or increased state resilience, as it were, might depend on that. What are your thoughts on that perpetuating division? And secondly, do you think that in the international response, particularly the donor government responses, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, so on, responses, these donors should insist on project agreements with subnational entities rather than trying to develop swaps, develop general budget support and so on through central government ministries that may be strongly inappropriate in that country context.
Thank you. I'm Martin Barber. I'm a former UN staff member. I found it extraordinary, and it was a great relief to hear you talk like that after 20 years of trying to get people to listen to this kind of analysis. I just want to give one example. In 2003, the constitutional lawyer Jirga in Afghanistan was split between those arguing for the French model, highly centralized presidency, and those arguing for the Swiss model of the decentralized cantonal regional structure. The international community sided overwhelmingly with the French model, thereby essentially perpetuating the destruction of the political consensus in Afghanistan and consigning us to the problems that we see now. How could they have been so stupid? I mean, seriously, how could they have been so stupid? And secondly, have you given this talk in New York? And if not, when will you give it in New York?
Is your name Arjun? Martin, excuse me.
Yeah, there was somebody. No, there was one here, and then team at the back.
Hi there, Seth. Steve Archibald. I run the Conflict and Transitional Governance practice for Cardinal Agrisystems. I really appreciate this distinction between state building and social capital. Now, in your talk, you gave a number of examples. You spoke about Liberia, Sierra Leone, Iraq. In each of these cases, the initial state-building processes preceded any form of nation-building process. And now, in our wisdom, we're repeating those same mistakes again. And I'm curious as to why you opt for the terminology social capital and social cohesion, which I think is a valuable one, but steer away from nation-building, and whether or not you think nation-building now is a step too far. I think you used the term feasible exercise. Do you think that nation-building in today's context is a feasible exercise? Thank you.
Tim.
Thank you, Seth, for a wonderful presentation. I just have one key question. You spoke about the international community being fragmented, and that is as a result of that, there doesn't seem to be a particular proper strategy as to how to engage fragile states. My thinking is that, I mean, and if I pick an example of Somalia, which you have worked on, and one that an area that I'm familiar with, is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of lesson learning here. I mean, if you mentioned $8 billion and 14 peace agreements down the line, nothing has worked in southern Somalia. Yet in the north, it seems something seems to be working, though not perfect. Okay, surely there's more than international fragmentation towards this, because the international community has seen what works in northern Somalia, because of course they are involved. They are part and parcel of the of engaging those traditional structures in Somaliland. Why is it not happening in the south? Surely, I would like to hear your thoughts as to why it is not happening in southern Somalia and it's happening in northern Somalia. The other point I'd like to make, I don't know who made the points about ethnicity in Africa. I think part of the problem, and this is my own take, is ethnicity itself is not a problem per se. I think the politicization of ethnicity, especially in African politics, becomes a problem. I come from Kenya, and I can tell you that 42 ethnic groups living side by side since time immemorial has been okay. The only problem is when politicians use ethnicity for their own agendas, and at the end of the day, compromises the security situations and livelihoods of the people on the ground. Thank you.
There's one last question here at the front, quick, and then we're going to stop. Give very much answers.
Elena Jurado, Head of Research of
Helena.
At Policy Network, an international
You're not from Troy by any chance,
no.
are you?
It's a very brief question, which perhaps you could give an answer to in the context of one of the other comments. You've spoken about the international community as a single entity, even though you said a number of times that it's fragmented. And I was just wondering, from the point of view of a changing international context, with China especially becoming a more important actor in the development field, is that also changing international discourses of development? And what kind of impact, if any, is it having on the particular issues that you raise? Especially, I would imagine, with a more hands-off approach to investing in developing countries. Is that a good thing in the large scale of things, given that perhaps there will be a movement away from single model approaches to development, or does that entail its own problems when it comes to imposing structures on other societies? Thank you.
David, why don't you start this time? I've got one or two maybe comments for you as well.
Yeah. I mean, Seth said I'm simplifying his argument by making it center on ethnicity. Yeah, maybe it is true that he talks about social cohesion and he talks a lot about social capital. But, well, my view is that actually we should call a spade in this context, and that it is actually time that we start thinking seriously about ethnicity and thinking about it not just as a negative thing which can be politicized in destructive ways, as Timothy is mentioning, but also as one of the sources of accountabilities that work. If we want accountabilities that work, we are in fact talking to a considerable extent about accountabilities that are internal to fundamental identity groups, which are ethnically defined. We should start viewing that as a positive thing and not as a necessarily negative thing. The other question I'd like to put back to Seth is about the way forward. He talks about building capacity within countries to develop new strategies and to change the storyline. Absolutely, but it's not clear to me exactly how that's going to happen. And I wonder if, in the meantime, we shouldn't be talking much more about getting international policy to be driven rather more by the country and regional specialists who know about these things and who understand them, who tend to get sidelined when it comes to the big policy decisions.
Okay, I'm going to go one by one, overlapping a little bit. Richard, who I think was online.
Yes.
Thank you for the very informed comment. It really hits the spot. I think the key point is, of course, balance. I don't mean to balkanize states. I don't mean to try to change the borders of states. In almost every case, it's not a realistic policy. Somaliland might be one small example, as well as some of the frozen conflicts in the Caucasus, et cetera, where there might, but let's not touch the political, that would be a little bit dangerous for me to get involved in such a discussion. But of course, when you're building pockets of cohesion in a country with very difficult and divided political geography, you need to balance that by certain measures which, of course, unify the country. We're not trying to divide a country. There is always going to be the danger that certain regions are going to advance faster than others. It's an unfortunate danger, but I don't see an alternative to that approach. To the extent that each region is equally cohesive, that should create a dynamic of competition. The rise of Europe, there's many reasons for the rise of Europe over the last half millennium, or however you want to date the beginning of the rise of Europe historically, but certainly the competitive state system that made each state fight or try to improve its income, its productivity, its tax revenue, its military. This competition of states played a very major role, as opposed to the other area where there was a greatly developed states, which is Northeast Asia, or to a certain extent the Middle East. One state dominated these regions, and there was very little competition between the states, actually, partly because actually in East Asia's case, the states were so cohesive. China a little bit different, but certainly Korea, Japan has a fixed context of what they could expand to. But there's not the same. The competition in Europe far greater than any place else, and this is one reason why the states developed. And I would like to think that pockets of cohesion could compete, and then there might be some income transfers if one state got developed as opposed to another. At the same time, you want to balance building some centralized state, common currency, maybe a rotating presidency. I'm much more in favor. The Swiss, don't have a national president that's elected to represent everybody. They have 7 people run Switzerland. Every year they rotate the presidency. That's not a perfect model, but if you had different regions and they came together to choose a bunch of people and those people rotated and the central government was limited to a few functions, that might, and the major money and responsibility was locally, that might be a much more a realistic model. I think it was James, you or anybody else, if you want to have a more detailed discussion, more than we can talk about here, you're more than welcome, you or anyone else. I'd be really happy to talk with you separately afterwards another day or by phone if I'm not in England, not in the United Kingdom. In terms of your issue, and I think it goes to a few other comments, ethnicity, I'm going to echo David here to some extent. Ethnicity, we would like to ignore it and wish it didn't exist. It's unrealistic. People care about their identity very much. Who are we to say they shouldn't care? Yes, politicians use it badly for bad reasons. I agree with that. Yes, ethnicity leads to conflict. Yes, ethnicity has many, many bad results. Ethnicity, on the other hand, could be the source of great social capital, could be the source of a great drive to promote and develop a region. But either way, to ignore the fact that people have these social relationships, have these loyalties, have these beliefs, that's not appropriate for us, actually. Yes, we want to build a greater overarching identity. Tanzania has been mentioned. Yes, we want to build some national unity, but to deny people their beliefs, that's very, I would say, simplistic or not a realistic policy. People want to believe what they believe. To the extent that we can lessen it or funnel it in ways that will lead to positive results, I think is more practical than ignoring it. In terms of different countries, Tanzania happens to have a good political geography, as has Ghana to some extent, which helped. Kenya has a more difficult political geography. There's different reasons that are beyond a simple discussion. But in terms of languages, again, it's a balance. You can build a national identity and not ignore local identities. Bolivia is a great example. You want to have some national identity in Bolivia, but to the extent that you teach in Aymara, you're teaching Quechua, that you recognize some local institutions, while not denying the people that don't want to adopt those institutions, those languages, is a much better approach than trying to impose one method or another method on everybody. Yes, you may weaken the identity of Bolivia to some extent, but I would argue that identity is not very strong when it comes down to people have multiple identities, and when there's peace and security, we all may say we love the Congo, we all may say we love Iraq, but if there's money or there's some conflict, we're all going to run back to who we really trust. And you need to slowly, gradually move to a more national identity longer term, but it may not be a practical policy in the short term. Edward, I think you have 2 specific questions. One is, I'm not a big fan of quotas, but to a certain extent, something like that might be required. Nigeria has some sort of power sharing, informal, formally, on the national level, which has helped with some of its problems. To the extent that Kenya does not have a method of sharing power, more in some method among different groups, is part of the cause of its problems. Certainly sharing important positions at a national level, at a bureaucratic level, making sure that distribution of money is fair. You're not going to be able to change in the short term the fact that some groups are much more efficient at making money than other groups. But to the extent that political power is relatively fairly shared, and culture, remember there's 3 elements of conflict between groups: political, economic, and cultural. I think Francis Stewart with Horizontal Equities has addressed the topic very well. And except that these 3 issues, economics is hard to deal with, but politics and culture can be dealt with relatively equitably in the short to middle long term. Economics is a much more hard problem to deal with. Martin, I think your only question was about New York City. I've talked about this actually in Washington more than New York for obvious reasons. If you want to organize something in New York, I'd be really happy anytime. I live in New York City. So I'd be happy to take a subway train ride. You tell me where to come. I mainly promote my talks in Washington, The ease of that, let's not go into right here. Steve and nation building. Actually, when I talk about cohesion, nation building and state building are very different things. To the extent that I talk about national social cohesion, that's nation building. The fact that I talk about cities of cohesion or regions of cohesion or institutions that leverage pockets of cohesion, are those nations? Are those cohesive groups of people from many ethnic, religious backgrounds? Are they one ethnic group like the Kurds, one clan like the Isak in Somaliland, whatever it might be? Are those nations? Are those pockets of cohesion? This is a political definition. It doesn't really matter. They may want to believe, is Catalonia a nation? Are parts of northern Italy a nation? These are very hard things to actually agree upon, but to the extent that a nation means a cohesive group of people, over time, maybe with the same institutions, driving a cohesive and a forward progress, in essence, they are becoming nations. But I use the word cohesion because I mean it on multiple levels, more than just the idea of a nation. Because in some cases you may not have a nation, but you may have people cooperating because they have a coalition of nations, so to speak, as may be the necessary case. 2 more to go. Tim, actually 3 more to go. Tim, I think in Somalia it's the great example the international community does not learn. I think evidence is pretty obvious. I think it should be obvious to people involved, but to the extent that the United Nations, the World Bank, and most donor agencies work only on states. They need a government as a counterpart. Their internal incentive system rewards people for how they deal with government. Statistics are government-based. You don't have group-based statistics. You don't have group-based analysis. You don't have much regional-based analysis or statistics. I mean, the whole mindset, the whole institutional environment where these organizations operate in are not designed to think sub-state or, for that matter, super-state. Some place like West Africa, I have a chapter on West Africa, these are more of a regional basis. Yes, you need a sub-state, but in some cases a regional process might help the fact that these states are too small to ever have enough capacity to drive forward. So in reality, I would argue the international community is very fragmented, but it's also dysfunctional how it's internally organized, each upon themselves. They don't think anything but state. Our friend Helena, if I said that correctly, I would argue that China, and I'm very aware of China's worldview after spending 7 years in Shanghai, China is going to be plus and minus. It might be more investment. It might be higher commodity prices. It might be a lot more infrastructure building for practical reasons. It might be less transparency. It might be much less attempt to think about state. China's not really interested in state building, but things that China do might actually help states build, might raise the incomes of lots of people. But they don't really care about state building, actually. They only care about, they're self-interested. And having said that, I don't think we're not self-interested. We have a different dialogue. We have a different ideology about our idea of aid and how we're really trying to help other people. But are we really helping other people by what we do? We're often driven by our own self-interest or our interest to, hate to say this, our interest to feel good. But it's good to want to feel good. The question is, how do you funnel that positive desire to something that's helpful? We're also self-interested, and that's why we're fragmented, and that's why we do certain things which don't help, but we need to look good. And so it's a mixed bag, positive and negative. And in terms of going forward, it's a very good question. I hope our meeting after this will address it. But certainly more strategy, more focusing on regional specialists. I actually think taking power away from economists and giving it to people who really know the situation. And I would say a lot more political scientists and a lot more anthropologists and a lot more empathy on many levels needs to be brought to bear on the problem of development. But the international agencies also need to think about these problems very differently. The storyline is very important, and the storyline as it is today is well-meaning but not necessarily helpful in the most fractured and fragile state.
Thank you. Alina, do you have any comments? We've got a few minutes left.
Well, because I'm picking up a few points, but
different identities at the regional level is one that offers examples of how can this be done. And this is also done through a formula of asymmetrical federalism, where different regions do help others to develop. And the idea there is that the Basque, the different groups that feel that they have an ethnic identity can have a say, a great local say in education policies, all of that in the different regions, and still get support from the national level. But I think I agree that it's a welcome insertion into the debate to talk about ethnicity, but I think we still have to remember that it has to be problematized because it may not provide all of the solutions that we want. And I actually wanted to ask David, because I don't know if the work of the APPP has gone into this, but in Rwanda, for example, there has been an attempt to, in fact, sweep the whole identity question or ethnicity question under the carpet and sort of pretend that, ethnicity has sort of somehow evaporated. And obviously that's not a healthy development either, but I was wondering if you could comment on how that is going, because that obviously is the trend that the Rwanda government is trying to implement at the moment. Sorry, this is not very coherent, but...
You're right.
Good luck with the baby.
Thank you.
More important than all of this discussion.
Rwanda may be an example of them sweeping a problem under the carpet and storing up problems for the future. But what's not entirely so well known about Rwanda is that the way the government is structured does involve power sharing rather than sort of winner takes all. So that the governing party actually only has sort of half of the cabinet posts. And although that may not be all that significant because the other legal parties are all really rather small, the idea is there. This idea that the fundamental thing is to get a viable power sharing agreement as the basis of the state. Decentralization. I think it's important that. If I understand the argument correctly, the argument is not the traditional one about decentralization, that if you bring government closer to the people, you will get better accountability. It is very specifically a decentralization which is based on recognizing the fundamental group structure of a country.
Or promoting stronger groups at the same time in some cases.
Yeah. So it's very much decentralization in interaction with a subtle understanding of what the social structure is. And I think that would be part of the response to Ed. I mean, a donor relating to a subnational unit, which makes no sense in social terms, is very different from relating to a subnational unit which does make sense in social terms.
Okay, 2 o'clock, so it's time to, I'm afraid, close this meeting. I'm not going to attempt to sum it up because it was interesting and complex to do so. I take away at least 3 interesting points. I think the notion of inappropriate institution is very useful. It's going to be a concept that is going to help us think through institutions building beyond the usual what works and what doesn't. So think a bit more about what works where and why. I think that this debate about ethnicity is pretty crucial, and finding a way of bringing it back into the picture without overlooking its complexities, as Alina mentioned, is new and important. Overall, I got the feeling that we're all quite excited about this way of thinking. We've got some way to go in taking forward the practical implications, and that's, I guess, the challenge, the way forward for all of us. Thank you, Seth, for coming over and for the inspiring talk, and David for your comments, and all of you for participating.